Okay.
Cool.
So
All right, and then we have JimR.Wilson describing, defending, differentiating, and delivering a talk.
yes, thanks. Apologize for my ignorance on putting this thing on. I haven't had to do this in a while. So my talk's auspicious title is Describe, Defend, Differentiate, and Deliver. I'm hoping to do that for you today. I hope you noticed that on the schedule, the very next thing after this is the snack, which that's the good news. The bad news is that puts me in a great position to filibuster this entire conference. So you think I'm joking. By title, I'm an engineer, so that makes me the enemy, and I apologize. But I'm also a technical author. I don't stand here today as either an author or an engineer, though. I think of myself as a technologist, which is what we all are. And I have been a professional technologist for 10 or 11 years, and in that time I've gotten to use documentation in some very unconventional and beneficial ways. I'd like to talk to you about that for a little bit, and that'll lead naturally into a little discussion about trends in software as it relates to documentation, where I think things are going and how we can get there better together. So my story starts right out of college. I was working for a healthcare IT company for a team of about 17 people. I was the build guy. I was in that unenviable position of being the gatekeeper for stuff that goes out. And as a result, I was constantly inundated by questions like, what's the current version of code that's out there? When's the next version going out? And it was really distracting and repetitive and distracting. So I discovered Wiki, right? Wiki was my savior. So I set up a wiki and I decided to document all the things. And whether it was what version of the code had just gone out, what version was about to go out. And whenever someone would ask me the status, I would say, hey, don't worry about it. It's on the wiki. Here it is. And by the way, you can subscribe to the wiki page and get an email whenever there's an update, right? So documentation allowed me to defend and deflect a lot of that noise so that I could get to the business of implementing a real continuous integration system, which would just be correct all the time. My love affair with wikis didn't end there. I actually got me my next couple of jobs. I worked for a couple of years at a company called Vistaprint in their knowledge management team. That was all about documentation. My biggest takeaway from that was don't use SharePoint. Yeah, I could go on for an hour about all the things SharePoint does wrong, which we will get to in hour 3 of this filibuster. So I now work for a company called Brightcove. Brightcove is a fantastic place to work, and I've gotten to use documentation in some unconventional ways there as well. Early on in my career, we had a customer who wanted to do indefinite buffering, right? So in a video on the web, buffering is that little gray bar that tells you how much more you've downloaded than what you're actually looking at. And they wanted to be able to let their customers pause the movie, buffer, 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 and then play back the whole movie, right? So I won't go into why this is hard, but it was pretty hard. And at the time, our team used these 1-week-long sprints, and it was clear towards the end of the sprint, I was working on it alone, that the feature was like set to slip. And so I, again, decided to document all the things. So I made a list of the 5 remaining issues. I gave them names. One was called the Flushpocalypse, which the buffer would flush and the browser would crash. That was fun. Gave them names, made copious links to documentation I had found on the web, bug reports and such that showed other people had had those problems, and I presented this document to the team. It being towards the end of the sprint, the team was free to swarm on that list, and within a day or two, we had the remaining issues ironed out and a few extra ones at least scoped out, if not completely solved. Unbeknownst to me, the then CTO of Brightcove decided to send that very internal document directly to the customer, right? So it suddenly became external-facing documentation. And they were happy to get it because it showed to them that we knew what was going on, and even though we still had problems, we were on a path to solving them, right? So that was kind of a happy accident. It was a happy accident of documentation that it became an asset to us. Which brings me to assets and liabilities, right? So I spent a good deal of time trying to figure out something profound I could say to this audience for 4 to 12 hours. And one of the questions I came up with is, what is the purpose of documentation and what is the purpose of code, right? So we all work for software companies, and I use that term loosely because increasingly any company is a software company, right? The software industry is increasingly every industry. But software isn't really what we produce. And to understand why, I'd like to point to an old adage which says, functionality is an asset, code is a liability, right? And what this acknowledges is that any line of code could have a bug in it, any line of code could have a design flaw, the more code you have, the more you have to sift through in order to find things when things go wrong. But running that code, executing that code, is an asset that has value and which you can sell for a profit. So if there was going to be an equivalent saying for documentation, what I would say is understanding is an asset, documentation is a liability, right? Documentation can be wrong or misleading, documentation can get out of date, but the understanding that documentation produces is a valuable asset that customers like. So, and it was certainly the case for Brightcove's customer because that internal document I had made it into their hands, and they could understand that we had a grasp of the issues. They could understand that we knew what we were doing and that we were on a course to solve their issues. Right? So this notion... Okay, so I'm missing a slide here, but it's okay because my slides are... Like the first slide with my title on it, that was the wordiest slide I have. These are all like 2 words. So pretend there's a slide up here that says the product, right? So the notion that functionality is an asset and understanding is an asset, but code and documentation are liabilities, leads to this holistic look at what is the product, right? What is it that we actually produce? The product, for us, what we produce is the entire customer experience. It's the research they do before they buy, it's their interaction with the sign-in page, it's their 10-minute tutorial, it's their call to customer service. That whole thing is the product. And I think Kevin Hale's talk yesterday really summarized this well about having that holistic view of what is the product. So we shouldn't think of documentation as producing words, just as we don't think of software as producing code, right? Documentation produces understanding and code produces functionality. And when you have this sort of documentation thinking, it can let you do some creative things. So now my slide about hipsters. So I carry around with me this. It's basically a bunch of 3x5 cards held together with a binder clip. It's called a hipster PDA. Does anybody in the audience have one of these? A few? Oh, but you've at least heard of them? Okay. Yeah, these were popularized. Okay. These were popularized by Merlin Mann a little while ago, and this allows me to document things in an instant and make notes to myself, create future understanding for myself. So for example, I have a whole card on here of things that have gone wrong in the conference, which I would like to recite to you today. No, but seriously, the first thing on here was lighting for people upstairs. If you guys recall at the beginning of yesterday, people upstairs had some trouble with lighting and seeing their notes that they were writing. So I wrote that down, and that creates understanding for me. And as a happy accident, it gives me something to tell you right now on stage, right? So it's pretty meta, and I'm really enjoying it. So another example would be if you had a private repository that you commit your own documentation to yourself. If your audience is yourself, in order to try to have those happy accidents, you could commit your own notes to a repository. And then later on, if you need to, you can always dredge them up and email them to somebody and produce understanding in them, right? So email is another form of documentation because it produces understanding in others. It also tends to live forever, right? Emails never go away. So, understanding. So, as I mentioned before, I'm a technical author. I'm working on a book called Effective Node.js. The liability asset thing plays out here as well. Every line that I write in this book that's targeting the current version of Node is a liability because future readers of that book, they might not be using that version, it might be wrong, but the book itself creates understanding in them, and that's an asset that they're willing to pay for, hopefully. Please buy my book. So the product of documentation is understanding, and if you think of the whole product as that entire customer experience, it becomes a little more clear that documentation thinking, the caring about documentation, the caring about expressing understanding in others, deserves to be part of the integrated design and development software lifecycle. When I originally made this slide, I put a W on there because I thought it was like holistic. So, spell check, thank you. It is not. So back in the 1990s, software development was very sequential, right? You've heard of the waterfall method. I worked at a company that had this model where requirements came in from somewhere, our team of developers would develop, we would ship things off to a team in India for testing overnight, it would come back, we'd make some changes, And eventually we get shipped off to somewhere to get deployed. Presumably documentation happened, but if it did, I don't know by whom. In the 2000s, that kind of gave way, and we saw the rise of Agile. This is not news to anyone. And with Agile, we saw test-driven development. We moved from a very linear model of development to an integrated circle where you try to get something out the door right away, and then you iterate, and you make it better, and make it better, and make it better. To me, the interesting part about that is not so much the process change, but the accompanying organizational change. When you have an integrated development process, it makes sense to have an integrated team. So instead of having a team consisting solely of developers, it makes more sense to have a team that has some developers, but also some quality assurance engineers, and maybe somebody with design chops. Right? So, fast forward to today. We're now living in the dawn of the age of post-Agile, where we, yeah. Right. Yeah, that's mine, right? That's my, you owe me 25 cents every time you say it. We no longer stick dogmatically to the prescriptions that we get from, what is it, XP and Scrum, right? We try to continuously improve our process by retrospecting on it. We experiment with things like Kanban for limiting work in progress instead of always having a strict sprint. That's kind of where we're at. But for many companies, documentation is still that other piece. It's still that separate thing that you tack on at the end, right? It doesn't get a seat at the table. And so I think that the natural place for us to go with this is if you have a holistic view of the product as the entire customer experience, it makes sense that documentation thinking should be part of the process, and part of that integrated circle should include thinking about documentation. And the organizational equivalent of that process change is that documentarians, those people who care about documentation and seeing it work well, deserve to be part of the design and development of software, just as we saw quality assurance brought into that circle in the last decade. So as long as you think of the product as software, then it's easy to throw documentation over the wall. If you think of the product as the customer experience, it's clear that documentation thinking needs to be part of that. So what can we do, right? We've heard a number of speakers talk about things we can do to try to improve the situation for documentation for us technologists. Should we try to engender a culture of doc, right? Should we try to change people's behavior by explaining to them why they should behave better? Maybe. I mean, sometimes that works. Should we march up to upper management and bang on the door and demand that we become the gatekeepers of all commits? I mean, maybe. What I would encourage you to do is try to expand the definition of the product. If you reframe the world we live in as being that world where the product is everything, then a natural consequence is for documentation thinking to become an integrated part of our software development and design process. So, thus concludes the first 20 minutes of my filibuster. I thank you for your kind attention.